Hey, what's up, guys? Alex Baker here, aka AwesemoDFS. Excited to talk some Counter Strike fantasy. So, FanDuel just released their Counter Strike today, and they went with a much different scoring system than DraftKings. DraftKings, so they adjusted by the number of rounds played in a match, and that varies a lot because teams play to 16. There could be overtime. And if you don't adjust for the length of the match, it means that players that play in closer sets are going to accrue more fantasy points than ones that are more lopsided. And I'm going to demonstrate that in a second here. FanDuel does give a bonus for going 2-0 in a best of 3, but the 15 points they give out isn't really as much as you would get in a third round for each player. So that is going to make it so that if your guys are on a winning team that sweeps a match, they're going to be lower scoring than one that goes 2-1. So you're going to really want a competitive game that plays a lot of rounds on FanDuel. On DraftKings, you're going to want one that's lopsided because they're going to have the average fantasy points per game that are higher, and then you multiply it all out. And I'll show you guys exactly what's up with that here, because I got 25 box scores that have been played in the last few weeks, and for each of them, I compiled the fantasy points for DraftKings and FanDuel. And on the left here, this is DraftKings, this is FanDuel. So I'm going to start with this really lopsided game. So this one was 32-13, a two-set game, domination by the first team. And then on DraftKings, this was our third highest fantasy points total for the team over the sample of 25 games. So if we calculate the average fantasy performance here, for each team is 254. They scored 444, so nearly double, about 1.75 times the average fantasy performance because it was such a domination. And then they won 71% of the games, but got 94% of the fantasy points. Now the same team on FanDuel, I did incorporate the sweep in here, so 378 was the total number of fantasy points split up between the 5 players on the team. And it wasn't even a top 10 performance, even though it was the third best on DraftKings. So I think that the winning lineups on FanDuel and DraftKings are going to look very different every single day because the players you're going to need are totally different. So let's look at the FanDuel team that had the most fantasy points. It was this one here, 569 fantasy points. The average is 326, so quite a bit higher than the average. And the opposing team also had above average fantasy points, which is much different than on DraftKings, where they were both kind of close to the average. And this one, it went 100 rounds, and that means there was overtime in it. The teams went nearly 50-50 as far as rounds won and lost, and that was the biggest fantasy performance. So the way I've kind of been conceptualizing this for myself is in DraftKings, there's a relatively fixed amount of fantasy points to be distributed between the 10 players in Counter-Strike. So the lowest scoring game was 470. The highest scoring game was 559. So that's a range of 90 points. On DraftKings, the lowest scoring game in these 25 was 370. The highest scoring was 913. So that's a range of 540 fantasy points. So I think that you want to stack one team on both sites because there is a lot of correlation between members of the team, although it does appear to be a little bit less on FanDuel than on DraftKings, but they do have these overtime games that really pay off. And then the other correlation is that if your team sweeps, you're gonna have a very lackluster fantasy score, as we saw in these three examples. So if a team got 32 wins, that means they got the sweep. And in all of these examples, they were just very slightly above average in fantasy points. So these were all notable because, oops, this one was not a sweep. All right, so these were all notable because the other teams also had even worse fantasy performances, which is what we would expect. So these games would just be poison pills for your whole lineup, pretty much. Like maybe you could have one guy from these games and have a winning lineup, but there are going to be games in FanDuel, Counter Strike that are just low scoring that you're going to want to avoid. And ones that are big blowouts are the most likely to fall under this category. So because of this, the game stack and the game fade are both good strategies on FanDuel. So on DraftKings, I'm gonna find the correlation between Team 2's fantasy points and Team 1's fantasy points, and we find it's almost a 1-for-1 negative correlation. So if Team 1 scores more fantasy points, it's at the expense of Team 2. Now if I do the same thing for FanDuel, it's minus 0.1. So the relationship between Team 1 and Team 2's fantasy performances is much less correlated. So on DraftKings, if you're stacking several players from one team, you almost always want to fade everyone on the other team, because in these best case scenarios, the other team was either below average or significantly below average. On FanDuel, though, if we look at these three highest scoring games, the opponent in one of them was well above average, and the other two were slightly below average. When you average all three out, the winning teams with the highest scores did face opponents with pretty high fantasy performances themselves. So, on DraftKings, one of the biggest strategies for me is I'm going to take 3 players from one team, and then I'm going to avoid players on the other team. On FanDuel, I don't think you should try to force players in from an opposing team to your stack, but I don't think you should avoid it either, because if your stack wins 2-0, you're going to be in trouble anyway. So you're going to want a game that's 2-1, in which case both teams have a little bit better than average chance, even if you don't pick the one that has the more larger amount of fantasy points. So I hope this explains how you can really exploit the differences between DraftKings and FanDuel and Counter-Strike and pick up on some strategy that other people might not use. Of course, make sure to use the projections. I'm going to be releasing ownership and top stacks soon so that you can work those into your process as well. So thanks, guys, for checking out the video. And as always in esports, GLHF.